I'm so excited. All right, let's geek out about this. Okay, so I am Dr. Leah Leach. I am the headmistress of the Uhura Training Academy and the founder of Gal's Guide. Today, I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite people in the galaxy. I am not going to be able to hide my passion for this gal. I hope that it is infectious because honestly, more people need to know about her and celebrate her. I'm going to be talking about the inventor of rock and roll, a gal who started singing at church at the age of 4, rose to become gospel's first superstar. She shocked audiences when she decided to blend gospel and blues and electric guitar. She invented this new type of music that inspired Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Bob Dylan. Today we're digging into the heart of rock and roll, and we're going to talk about Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Okay, let's rock. I need to set a very brief history of rock and roll for you, though, just so you know kind of what we're dealing with a little bit. There are very thick books about the history of rock and roll. There are some long documentaries, 6-hour documentaries about the history of rock and roll. So let's remember that this is brief and people get very emotionally invested in the history of rock and roll. I've had a couple of arguments with people, mostly over dates, which is the ironic part for me because it's hard to argue a date. It comes before or after, but I regress. So the brief history of rock and roll is that it started as rhythm and blues in the American Black community in the 1930s, okay? It was a mix of gospel spiritual songs from the church and work songs from the cotton fields. It was sprinkled in with a little dose of big band and jazz, but it was called rhythm and blues in the 30s. It was also called race music. Sometimes it was called sepia, and sometimes it was called hit parade, okay? And this is like a Billboard chart. It'll say the race music chart, the sepia chart, the Harlem hit parade chart. Just like segregation, at water fountains, there was separation of the charts of records, featuring Black artists was the separation. After World War II ended in 1945, there was prosperity in the white middle class of America, and teenagers had a lot more free time and spending money. They were not amused by the wholesome sounds of Perry Como or Frank Sinatra. I do still love me some Frank Sinatra. Perry Como can suck it. I can tell you later why. But the teenagers started to look at other radio stations on the dial. They started tuning in to rhythm and blues stations. So when an Ohio radio DJ named Alan Freed got wind of what these white teenagers were listening to, he started playing rhythm and blues on his mainstream station in Ohio. In 1954, he started calling it rock and roll. The sale of race records saw a huge increase. White record producers started to take notice on this, and many covers were made with having white performers, Perry Como, talking about you, singing hits by Black artists. Now, unfortunately, these covers would outsell the originals. But also around this time, Sam Phillips was in Memphis, and he was recording Black rhythm and blues artists, and he was thinking, the real money is finding a white guy that matches this same feeling, and then he found Elvis. Now, Elvis and his friend, George Klein, before meeting Sam Phillips, they would spend their Sunday nights going to Black churches and listening to gospel music. In a very interesting role reversal, George Klein talked about in an interview how he and Elvis had to sit in the back of the church because they were white. Now, gospel was a huge influence on Elvis in his singing and his styling. You know who he was a huge fan of? Well, the #1 gospel recording artist at the time of Elvis's kind of like introduction to gospel music was Sister Rosetta Tharpe. And she would be the one that Elvis would very much try to emulate. A little aside here, when Elvis walked into Sun Studios, there's this very famous interaction between Elvis and Marion Kessler. Marion asked him who his singing sounds like, and Elvis famously said, "I don't sound like nobody." Well, when Sister Rosetta Tharpe is compared to male guitarists, she always says, "Can't no man play like me, I play better than any man." So you can kind of see how both of them have that same kind of bravado, that same priding themselves on being absolutely unique. However, Sister Rosetta Tharpe was doing this rock and roll thing when Elvis was in diapers. But that's all right, mama. See what I did there? Elvis song. Anyway, so while white DJ, record producers, and artists were branding this new rock and roll and targeting it to American teenagers, they were also whitewashing the originators. But teenagers then, as well as now, a lot of them were woke. And they were seeking out the original work. They're like, we know this isn't the original. Who originally did it? Let's go buy those records. So because of those teenagers who sought out the originators, mainstream record companies and radio stations would start playing Chuck Berry and Fats Domino, Little Richard, and more and more. Because now, when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, I was either told or just kind of like culturally thought that Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock was the first rock and roll song. I'm still not even sure like how that actually kind of cemented, but it's not. It's way not. There were songs that were recorded way before Rock Around the Clock. Many historians talk about Rocket 88 by Ike Turner, released in 1951. Ike Turner is this whole other thing. If you know about Ike and Tina, it's a thing. But 1951. But there were songs that were very rock and roll similar before that were Fats Domino's 1950s The Fat Man. And sometimes you have to look back even further than the 1950s for the invention of rock and roll. In 1938, Sister Rosetta Tharpe released That's All and Rock Me. She released This Train in 1939. Both of them featured a very fast electric guitar rhythm, amazing picking, and a guitar solo. Gospel in lyrics, but in its musical styling, it was not quite jazz, it was not quite swing, it was not quite blues. What would somebody call it? Well, in 1942, again, this is before all of the 1950s coining of rock and roll, Marie Odenkirk described Sister's vocals as, quote, rock and roll spiritual singing. There's that term before Alan Freed, the Ohio DJ. This is 12 years before Alan Freed coined that term, rock and roll. What the music industry influencers are very tight-lipped to say that Sister Rosetta Tharpe is the inventor of rock and roll. Now, I will be fair that also industry people cannot agree on who invented the electric guitar. The electric guitar is as like fought after as who invented rock and roll. However, Sister Rosetta Tharpe is very commonly called, without much debate, the godmother of rock and roll. So that is when people are playing it safe. That is what people will say so that, you know, nobody really gets too much into a fight with them. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018 as an early influencer. That is what they were okay with calling her, an early influencer. WUNC, a North Carolina public radio station, said this about Sister Rosetta Tharpe. They said, she was the leading figure in birthing rock and roll. And on the Rock Newman show, which is a video and a podcast, he was wowed by Sister Rosetta Tharpe's story, demanding from this day forward, Sister be called the real originator of rock and roll. So we're going to get into her life and to her legacy, and I'm going to let you decide if you are ready to call her the inventor of rock and roll or not. But let's start at the beginning. That is our basis, all right? So Sister Rosetta Tharpe was born as Rosetta Nubbin, just Nubbin. Sorry, I'm also a Friends fan, so Nubbin. March 20th, 1915. She was born in Cotton Plant, Arkansas. Her mother was Katie Bell Nubbin, and her father was Willis Atkins. Both of her parents were cotton pickers. Not much is known about her father, but her mother was a singer, a mandolin player, and an evangelistic preacher in the Church of God of Christ, otherwise known as Kojic, C-O-G-I-C. Sometimes you'll see that initials throughout history, the Kojic Church. So the church encouraged musical expression in worship, and it allowed women to preach. Her mother was very active in music and included Rosetta from the time she was 4 years old. Rosetta was playing guitar and singing songs like Jesus on the Main Line, and little Rosetta was known as the singing and guitar playing miracle. She was very young and she was very talented from the get-go. Rosetta was 6 years old when her mother left her father and they went on tour. So mother and daughter traveled as regular performers in evangelical troops, and they did hybrid performances. They did part sermon and part gospel concert before audiences across the American South. Rosetta would sit on top of the pianos at churches and she would play her guitar and she would sing so that everybody could see her. Her exuberance and her talent started at a very young age. So in the mid-1920s, Rosetta and her mother had settled in Chicago, where they continued to perform religious concerts at the Kojic Church and occasionally traveled to other churches and conventions throughout the country. So because of all of this time on the road and this connection to the church, Rosetta developed a considerable fame as a musical prodigy. She stood out in an era when prominent Black female guitarists remained very rare in existence. When Rosetta was 19 years old, her mother decided it was time for her to get married. Yeah, her mother decided it, and set her up with a reverend, the Right Reverend Thomas Thorpe. The marriage didn't work out. Surprise, surprise. It's all right. He did use her to make money and to get more people to come to his church. Rosetta was not happy about it. They separated after 4 years. Rosetta and her mother moved to New York. However, Rosetta decided to keep her married name. So that's where she gets the Tharpe from, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. But actually, sorry, his last name was Thorpe and she changed it to Tharpe. That's where the change comes in. So she was known as Sister Rosetta Tharpe for the rest of her life, okay? In New York, she had turned some heads and got some very powerful people's attention. In December of 1938, she performed at Carnegie Hall. She was part of John Hammond's famous Spiritual to Swing concert, performing gospel not in a church setting, but to secular audiences. It was very weird to the religious circles that loved her and were familiar with her. Performing next to jazz artists and blues artists was also very jarring to some. The weirdest thing of all to pretty much everybody in the audience was that it was a woman playing an electric guitar in Carnegie Hall in 1938. That part was quite odd. According to biography.com, quote, the performance shocked and awed the Carnegie Hall audience. It was revolutionary. She followed up a regular performance at the Cotton Club. So she was at the Cotton Club where she played and sung with Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington. I love them. Sister was the first gospel performer to play to white-only audiences. That's a big deal. In 1939, she was in Time magazine with the headline, Swinger Sings Same Songs in Church as in Nightclub. At first, her church revival fans thought she was off. She had lost her rocker. But really what it was is they were hurt because Rosetta was theirs. You know, she was part of their community. They got her. But they realized that how much they loved her, they had to share her with the rest of the world. They had to share her. They had to let other people love her as well. So how did she get this amazing record deal? Okay. So in 1938, when Rosetta moved to New York City, she signed with Decca Records. She was the first gospel musician to have a record recording contract. So the very first ever recording gospel musician to have a record deal. Black, white, female, male, first one ever. She was backed by Lucky Milliners Jazz Orchestra, and she recorded 4 songs for Decca for her very first one. She recorded Rock Me, That's All, The Man and I, and The Lonesome Road. Those were her first 4 in 1938. All 4 of these recordings became like instant hits, okay? Rosetta was the nation's first commercially successful gospel singer, and it took off. Absolutely took off. Rock Me influenced many rock and roll singers, such as Elvis Presley, who was obsessed with gospel music, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis. Remember that music critic, Marie Odenkirk? He described Rock Me as Sister Rosetta Tharpe for rock and roll spiritual singing. Because the way that she says rock me, it gives a little rock and roll feel, let me tell you. It's biblical in more ways than one. Let me go with that. Some musicians were inspired by her voice, some by her soul, some by her energy, some by her blend of genres, but many musicians were inspired by simply the way she played guitar. It was unlike anybody else that was out there, the way that she played it. So Sister strummed using an ancestor of the windmill technique. So I'm not a musician, but I know a little bit about it to make me dangerous, I guess is the word. The windmill technique is, if you've ever watched Pete Townsend from The Who, where he does that big all the way around strumming sort of thing, the overextending of the I'm playing this one chord and I'm going all the way around it, that has said to be started with Pete Townsend of The Who, or Keith Richards. Sometimes there's debate on Keith Richards with the Rolling Stones doing that too. No, Sister Rosetta Tharpe's been doing that since like 38. So it's described as by Michael Ross as, quote, this way. She slams a chord and waves her arm back and forth in a move that is simultaneously testifying and directing the chord repeatedly, blending the notes like a choir director's baton. Isn't that a gorgeous way of describing the way music is played? So it did bother some, okay? Some people in the church didn't like the idea that there was a mother of rock and roll. At the time, churchgoers were shocked by this mixture of gospel-based lyrics and secular-sounding music, plus the fact that it was sung in a secular world, not just sung in the church. But for as many people that there was that didn't like it, there was lots more people that did like it. So Sister started performing at many different locations outside of church. At this point, it did strengthen her fame, getting outside of just the church circuit. It was controversial, though, because singing gospel songs in nightclubs alongside blues and jazz musicians, sometimes she would sing gospel among scantily clad showgirls. Other times, it was very rare for a woman to be, let alone a gospel singing woman, to be singing on stage with her clothes on. That was also kind of unheard of in some of the nightclubs. Rosetta unintentionally started drifting away from the church community to spread gospel music beyond the church walls. It has been suggested that Rosetta was at odds with the record company when she was signed. There is a quote that is said, quote, "Rosetta and Milliner were increasingly at odds in 1943 as Rosetta itched to quit the big band circuit and renew her career strictly as a gospel act." She wanted to go back to her roots. Roxy Moore in a documentary said this about this particular time. She said, quote, "She hadn't wanted to do that light, fair poking around at old-time religion or worldly material like Tall, Skinny Papa, but she found herself bound by contractual obligations." So basically what we would call pop love songs, Sister didn't want to do those, but her record company wanted her to. So that was kind of the animosity, the debate, the trying to leave, and then kind of pushing her back into, I think I want to do gospel. So Sister was on the road for most of 1940. She started the decade, the 40s decade, at 25 years old, okay? She was rated the most popular musician of the day. She was gospel's first superstar. The girl had crossed the music genres and crossed the color lines. She was a wonderful rarity. She headlined tours with white and black artists on the roster. In the BBC documentary, The Godmother of Rock and Roll, which I sent a link to today in the cadet email, the BBC documentary talked about her touring with the Dixie Hummingbirds and the Jordanaires. And it interviews them in that documentary, which is really nice to talk about the tour that they went on. Rosetta had a bus with her name on it. And many times the artist had to sleep on the bus because of segregation, because of racism. Restaurants and bathrooms were the same story with segregation and racism. There were certain places they couldn't stop. There were certain places where they couldn't sleep. There were certain places where they could not eat. And she was the #1 gospel superstar and super famous around America. And yet still the doors were closed to her in many places. Her tours prompted the song "Strange Things Are Happening Every Day." This has been covered by quite a few artists. It's a wonderful mix of jazz piano, electric guitar, and gospel put to a very bouncy beat. And it is a reflection of that time on the road in the 1940s of the segregation of the road. Strange things are happening every day. It's the different things that she is seeing. It was the biggest hit of her career, of her entire career. It was covered by Johnny Cash. It was covered by Tom Jones. It was covered by Etta James and more artists as well. But those are the ones that are like, yeah, I might have heard of them. In the mid 1940s, she had another breakthrough by teaming up with pianist Sammy Price. And they recorded a combination of piano, guitar, and gospel pieces. The duo was most famous for "The Strange Things Happen Every Day," but they also had "Two Little Fishes and Five Loaves of Bread" was one of their other collaboration songs that was very, very popular. In 1946, Sister saw Marie Knight perform at a Mahalia Jackson concert in New York. And Sister recognized a special talent in Marie. 2 weeks later, she showed up at Marie's doorstep and invited her to go on the road on the tour with her. In a very brave and daring move, Sister and Marie toured the gospel circuit as a duo for a number of years. Marie sang and played the piano, and Sister sang and played the electric guitar. The duo recorded hits Up Above My Head, Gospel Train, where this was the other one that was most famous for the duo. It was not normal to see two women be on stage without a dude. It was not normal. It was even odder for two women to be on tour without a man. And they did. So Sister and Marie were thought to not only be partners on stage, but also lovers. Sister had dated both men and women in her past, and her friends often said that they were lovers, but there was no public announcement because it would ruin their careers, especially with a connection to the church. But their careers were already starting to be strained just simply because they were Black women touring without men. So they were kind of going to be damned if they did, damned if they didn't. But unfortunately, starting in 1949, their popularity started to take a downturn. Marie harbored a desire to break free as a solo act and get into popular music, but then tragedy happened. Marie's mother and two small children were killed in a fire, and she was heartbroken. So the two of them, Sister and Marie, they broke up. They went their separate ways. They would still kind of perform together from time to time, but it was never the same. The same year, to commemorate Sister's first anniversary of being a Virginia homeowner, didn't know this was a thing, but it's a thing, she put on a concert. That's the celebration, at what is now known as the Altria Theater. So supporting her for that concert were the Twilight Singers, who later became known as the Rosettes, because Rosetta Tharpe rosettes, yeah, they're little flowers. In 1950, Marie and Sister got back together to perform at the Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C. The concert did well, but the promoters, Ivan and Izzy Fields, were planning for the second show. That's when Marie and Sister broke up, was during that, let's do a second show. So Irvin had this idea of let's make it a concert and a wedding. Why not, right? So Fields would promote it as a way to promote Sister, but Sister had to go find a husband before the show. So they were selling tickets to the public when Sister met Russell Morrison. Because nothing like, I guess I gotta go get me a husband. Now, Russell loved the music industry, but he couldn't sing, he couldn't play, and that's fine, that's fine. After the wedding, Russell would become not only Sister's husband, but her manager. And that didn't go the greatest for the couple, but they would remain married until her death. The wedding was elaborate, okay? Not the courtship, but the wedding was elaborate. People brought wedding gifts. The main public bought wedding gifts. It was so massive. There was fireworks afterwards. There was about 25,000 people in attendance. It was a concert and a wedding. It was weird. There was also a record released of the ceremony and concert. Marie Knight actually came. She was Sister's maid of honor. Her backup singers, the Rosettes, were her bridesmaids. And Lucky Milliner, who was Sister's recording artist at the beginning of Decca, that was Russell's best man. The bride was beautiful. The evening was a success. And somehow no one realized how weird this whole thing just was. Sister had a way with people. She made them feel comfortable. She made them feel welcome. She made them feel like family, even if that came at a very exalted ticket price. We're totally okay with that. As Stevie Wonder would write later in a song, what followed was 7 years of bad luck after the wedding. Sister Rosetta fell on the back burner for a while. She didn't have any new content, any new songs. Her songs were suddenly considered old. As her songs grew less popular, she didn't have any more gigs to play. She moved into a row house in Philadelphia, and she lived a fairly quiet life for a while with her husband. In 1957, a man by the name of Chris Barber remembered her and asked her to go on tour with him and his band. She toured for a month, and they were a huge hit because it was gospel and rock and roll in Europe. And it was brand new to Europe, this idea of gospel and rock and roll. It was Sister and Chris Barber's band that were Europe's early introduction into rock and roll in 57. She was a sensation again. She quickly stole the spotlight from Chris Barber and the band, but they really didn't seem to mind. So now, in 1964, for musical fans, that date might ping some things. It's important to know in this musical context that there was a folk revival was at its peak, okay? And Sister was playing as part of the folk, blues, and gospel caravan tour that was going around England. During that tour, she made a special nationwide broadcast concert on Grenada television. The concert was at an unused railway in on Willabram Road in Manchester. And I shared this in the cadet logs too, the Connect email of the Manchester concert. She arrived on a horse-drawn carriage, and she walked her way to the train's platform. And across the other side of the tracks were filled with hundreds of young people. It was cold, it was rainy, it was England. And she opened with the song, Didn't It Rain? Right? And she nails it. She's just gorgeous at it. Then she goes into This Train, which I also included in that email, and I will put in the show notes as well. Bob Dylan, who you might remember started in folk music, before he was booed when he picked up an electric guitar. Bob Dylan said this about that 1964 England concert. He said, quote, "I'm pretty sure there are a lot of young English guys who picked up electric guitars after getting a look at her." I mean, Dylan did. So if you're interested in her railway performance from 1964, it is on YouTube. Again, I did link it, and I will put it in the comments as well. It's amazing, amazing. It's something to be experienced. So if you don't believe me, Dylan was a very big fan of Sister as well. He said on his Theme Time radio hour, this is Bob Dylan saying this, quote, "Sister Rosetta Tharpe was anything but ordinary and plain. She was a big, good-looking woman and divine, and not to mention sublime and splendid. She was a powerful force of nature, a guitar-playing, singing evangelist." That's Bob, man of few words. So while she was in Europe, her mother was growing frail and unfortunately passed away. Rosetta would tour Europe only for a few more years before she started to feel ill. Back in America, Rosetta had a stroke, and she had a few spots on her feet that turned out to be diabetes. She had let her condition go so long that her leg had to be amputated. Sister talked about making a big comeback to friends and family. However, she had a second stroke and she passed away a few days later. Sister Rosetta Tharpe was only 58 years old. She died October 9th, 1973 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now here's the real heartbreaking bit. Even though Sister Rosetta Tharpe was loved by European audiences for over 20 years, and American audiences had forgotten about her even though they loved her once in the 30s and 40s, her funeral was said to be half full when she was buried at Northwood Cemetery. She was buried without a gravestone marker, and she nearly vanished into absolute obscurity. In 1998, there was a postage stamp in her honor. In 2003, there was a tribute album made of her songs by Bonnie Raitt and Joan Osborne, there we go, and Sweet Honey in the Rock, who I adore. In 2007, she was inducted into the Blues Hall of Fame. But the major champion of Sister's story and Sister's legacy is this book by Gail Wald. Gail Wald is the major researcher and champion of Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Shout, Sister Shout was published in 2008. Because of her extensive research, because getting on television and doing appearances, the BBC made that documentary about Sister, and it was shown on PBS American Masters as well in the United States. Bob Mertz, a writer in Pennsylvania, saw Gail in a TV interview, and he was taken so much by Sister's story that he organized a benefit concert, and they paid for a gravestone marker for Sister. So she now has one. The resurgence of Sister Rosetta's legacy just might be why finally she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as an early influencer. It was 2018 when she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, the legacy that she left behind is Elvis's sound, Chuck Berry's guitar style, Johnny Cash blend of gospel and folk. These are all things that Sister influenced. But more than that, Sister has an overarching legacy. Because when you see her perform, you feel like she is not holding back. You are getting all of her. You're getting all of her voice. You're getting all of her energy. You're getting all of her guitar playing. She's giving you every bit of energy she has. She's sweating. Glistening is more the word for it, but it's everything. And I think more than that, that feeling when she plays, that energy that she's giving out is rock and roll. That's the rock and roll aspect that so many other rock and roll artists are trying to emulate, that are trying to get that part of that magic in a bottle and give that to an audience. And that, for me, more than anything, her energy is rock and roll. And that's where it came from for me. Because rock and roll is more about a feeling than it is about a particular, whatever, I can't remember what it is, 3/4 rhythm, 4/4 rhythm. I know it's 3 chords and a dream. Every rock and roll song is 3 chords and a dream. So please, listen to her music. I didn't play it for you during this class because YouTube would have a field day with it and ping it because it finds the audio codes and it would say that, hey, you're playing copyrighted music, and then it would probably take this whole video down. But that is why I shared links, and that is why I will have links in the comments as well to go on a journey of listening to her music, exploring other artists that pop up that are similar, really contrast and compare. If you haven't heard Chuck Berry in a while, listen to Sister, listen to Chuck Berry. If you haven't heard Little Richard's music in a while, listen to Sister, listen to Little Richard. Elvis, Johnny Cash, same thing. Dylan. Listen and compare and contrast. You'll get it. Your brain's gonna feel it really, really fast. Oh, I hear it, feel it, I get it. You know what I mean? It's a very personal journey, but it's one that I hope you open yourself up to. And I hope that you too become an insane cheerleader for Sister Rosetta Tharpe like I do, because the idea that a bisexual Black woman invented rock and roll is too much for some. It's perfect because she does not get enough credit, probably because of those labels on her. But it does not matter because she invented something that is so magical, that has influenced so many people, and that representation absolutely matters. So I will open it up for questions, to recommend listening, because I want you to decide at what point she invented rock and roll. Sorry, I mean, I'm kind of like leading you there. Leading the witness sort of situation. Yes. All right. So I will open it up for questions and general geeking out about Sister Rosetta Tharpe. So you can go ahead and unmute your glorious